There's a photograph from a Vermont summer where the sky seems to lean down and listen. Two young actors stand close but not showy, smiling the way people do when they aren't performing for anyone, promising something with their eyes that they don't yet have the words for. It's 1988, and the world knows them as quick-witted characters on a beloved sitcom and a rising voice from the New York stage. But what they are building in that moment is far quieter and far braver, a partnership that will outlast trends, outtalk headlines, and hold steady when the ground moves. Michael J. Fox and Tracy Pollan didn't set out to become symbols of resilience. They set out to love each other well. Decades later, the evidence of that love, woven through children raised, causes served, and a life balanced between public purpose and private tenderness, becomes its own kind of legacy. And the story feels less like celebrity and more like the steady beat of a home. Michael came into the 1980s like a spark, timing, charm, and a comic rhythm that could turn a living room quiet into laughter in 3 words. He was quick without being slick, a rare talent who seemed as surprised by his success as everyone else was delighted by it. Tracy arrived by a different road. She was trained for the long run, a student of craft who learned to listen to the silences in a scene and to live inside the ordinary details that make a character real. If Michael's gifts were kinetic, Tracy's were grounded. Both were serious about the work, and both understood something essential about fame. It is a breeze, not a compass. What neither of them knew yet was that the other would become the compass. They met in 1985 on the set of a show that had become part of America's weekly ritual. She walked into Family Ties to audition for Ellen Reed, the bright, principled match who would challenge Alex P. Keaton in the way that Real Love challenges all of us, by asking us to grow. The chemistry between the characters lit up the screen, but off-camera the tone remained professional. They were both focused on doing good work. The scenes were sharp and funny, but the memory that stayed was mutual respect. Sometimes a love story doesn't begin with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with the quiet awareness that this person takes the work as seriously as you do, that this person is kind to the crew, that this person understands the difference between attention and intention. That was the first seed, respect before romance. And if the viewer looked closely, they might have sensed it, 2 people instinctively giving each other room to be excellent. 2 years later, the second chance arrived. The set changed, life changed, the orbit shifted. In the film Bright Lights, Big City, they encountered each other again, and the timing, that mysterious third partner in every love story, had finally aligned. What had been a teammate's warmth turned toward a courtship's glow. There was no elaborate choreography, just dinners, laughter, and the easy continuity that comes when 2 people discover they have been moving toward one another for a long time without noticing. The pace felt right, grounded in how they had first met, as collaborators, and professionals who valued the same things. In late December 1987, surrounded by the afterglow of the holidays, Michael proposed. It was intimate and unambiguous, a choice made without publicity in mind. By July of the following year, they were married in Vermont, a ceremony that centered the family and kept the world at a gentle distance. The vows were the point, not the photos. What they decided next, how to protect the sweetness of ordinary life in an extraordinary industry, would shape everything. Those first years look familiar to anyone who has tried to build a home while both partners carry big jobs and bigger expectations. There were early mornings and late calls, readings and fittings, set days and stage nights. But the rhythm of their marriage developed quickly. They would be each other's first audience and most honest editor. If one of them rushed toward an idea, the other would slow down long enough to ask better questions. If one took on something ambitious, the other would hold the rope steady from home. They learned the art of checking in, the simple daily habit that quietly saves so many relationships. How was it really? They protected dinner when they could. They protected weekends when they could. And when they couldn't, they protected tone, keeping humor close and frustration short-lived. Privacy was not a reaction to fame. It was a deliberate posture toward joy. Parenthood put an exclamation point on those choices. Their son Sam arrived in 1989, and the world shifted focus. The details of career were still important, but the center of gravity had moved. 6 years later, twin daughters, Aquina and Skylar, joined the family, and in 2001, their youngest, Esme, completed the circle. Each child changed the temperature of the house in a new way. There were seasons of backpacks and bedtime stories, homework spread across the table, and the gentle choreography of 2 careers navigated around school plays and dentist appointments. Photos from those years show the same expression across time, Parents whose pride has nothing to do with applause. The laughter in those pictures is the laughter of inside jokes and remembered lines from family movies. The lessons of those years are the ones anyone who has juggled work and home will recognize. Get comfortable with the plan changing. Keep your promises small but consistent, and make room for each person's way of refueling. Life, as it always does, delivered its unplanned chapter. In 1991, at just 29, Michael received a diagnosis that arrived like an unwelcome headline across an otherwise ordinary day: Parkinson's disease. There is no right way to hear those words, but there are better and worse ways to respond. He and Tracy did what wise people do when the ground tilts: they made time. They kept the news private for a while, not out of denial, but out of reverence for the complicated work of adjusting. They talked about what it might mean for their careers, for their children, for their daily rhythms. They leaned even harder on humor, not the sharp kind that cuts, but the warm kind that makes room for fear and still keeps the light on. When Michael decided to share the diagnosis publicly several years later, he did it with the tone that would become his signature: candid but not dramatic, hopeful without being naive. It mattered that Tracy sat beside him, not as an accessory to a press moment, but as the person who had lived the private hours and would live the next chapter with him, one day at a time. There is a moment in many love stories when the relationship reveals its architecture. For Michael and Tracy, it emerged in a decision not to turn away from the hard part. The diagnosis did not become the definition of their marriage, but it did become a call. In 2000, they helped bring to life an idea that blended personal experience with public purpose: a foundation dedicated to accelerating Parkinson's research. The premise was radical in its simplicity: move fast, remain transparent, fund what works, center the patient experience, and treat the scientific community like a team, not a competition. Tracy's influence is everywhere in that mission, especially in the quiet insistence on clarity, care, and pacing. The result was more than fundraising, it was culture shaping. Over the years, the foundation would channel an extraordinary amount of resources into studies, collaborations, and clinical trials, reshaping the field's momentum. But for the couple at the heart of the story, the goal always sounded like a household conversation: how do we help people live better now? And how do we pull the future closer for those who will be diagnosed tomorrow? None of this unfolded in a straight line. Marriage is a living thing, and so is a life lived in public. Early on, as he faced fear and uncertainty, Michael shared that alcohol briefly became a refuge. In 1992, he let it go and chose a steadier way forward. They've never treated that season like gossip or spectacle. They talk about it with the same tone they bring to everything else: straightforward, grateful for the grace that helps people make new choices, and focused on what comes next. What came next, crucially, was a recommitment to the center of their life, each other and their children, and to the long runway of purpose their foundation provided. Some couples climb the same hill again and again. They learned how to press forward together. If you trace the arc of their public story from that point, a pattern emerges. The alternation between advocacy and family is constant. One week, a donor dinner, handled with grace and the soft humor that puts a room at ease. The next week, a school milestone, the ordinary pride of watching a child's effort turn into a small triumph. There are photos of galas and photos of everyday errands, and they tell the same truth: home is the point, the rest is what fills in around it. It is one thing to say that in interviews. It is another thing to live it, when scheduling, expectations, and the occasional noise of attention test a family's priorities. The people closest to them consistently describe a house that is warm, a partnership that defaults to kindness, and a marriage practice summed up in a deceptively simple phrase: assume the best. Assume the best is not a slogan, it is a discipline. In everyday practice, it looks like this: when one person is short, the other asks, "Long day?" not "What's wrong with you?" When plans shift, the instinct isn't to tally the inconvenience, but to offer the most generous possible interpretation of why it happened. Over time, that approach builds a house where mistakes can be named without shame and where fatigue is handled with tenderness instead of sarcasm. In the years when symptoms were new and schedules had to be renegotiated, that discipline preserved harmony. In the years when the kids were teenagers, full calendars, bigger feelings, it preserved trust. And as the foundation grew and the couple found themselves, again and again, at the center of rooms that looked to them for hope, it preserved authenticity. People can feel the difference between a performance and a presence. What lasts in conversation after conversation is the sense that Michael and Tracy show up as themselves and leave the room better than they found it. For viewers who loved Michael's early work, it's tempting to consider the film and television credits as the main storyline. In truth, the work became a supporting character to the larger narrative of family and advocacy. He acted when it made sense, with roles that matched energy and purpose, and he stepped back when life at home or the pace of advocacy needed to be first. That kind of flexibility is hard for anyone. It is especially difficult in a field that rewards momentum. Tracy's example, in her own career choices and in the steadiness she brought to family life, helped make that flexibility possible. The point of a partnership is not to be identical. The point is to be complementary. Their example, over and over, is of two people whose differences fit together into a circle. Meanwhile, the foundation they shepherded did more than raise money. It lent urgency to science, particularly the search for tools that could diagnose and track Parkinson's with clarity. For decades, patients and doctors lived with a frustrating reality. Definitive diagnosis depended on clinical presentation rather than a single conclusive test. Research teams across the world, collaborating through data projects and cohort studies, worked toward a breakthrough that would allow scientists to detect the disease's hallmark protein in living people. When that work reached a new milestone, validating a method of identifying the misfolded protein central to Parkinson's, the entire field felt the shift. It was not a cure, not a tidy ending, but it was a door in a wall, a way to let trials begin earlier and to measure progress more intelligently. Families felt it too. Hope, properly understood, is not a fantasy. It is a schedule. It is research in motion, clinics adjusting protocols, and people waking up to headlines that mean something concrete in their everyday lives. Public honors arrived along the way, the kind that celebrate not only talent but character. Standing on stages built for applause, Michael chose gratitude instead of grandiosity, and he used the microphone to turn attention outward, toward patients, scientists, caregivers, and the volunteers who sign up for the meticulous work of clinical studies. Tracy's presence at those ceremonies told a deeper story than citations ever could, that none of this was a solo performance. A long marriage is a duet that moves through tempos no composer could fully predict. One partner stills while the other steps forward, then the roles reverse, then they walk shoulder to shoulder again. If you've watched them over the years, at a dinner, in a hallway, at a premiere, you notice the shorthand of couples who truly like each other. A half smile, a light touch on an elbow, a glance that says, "You've got this," or "Let's go home." That's not show business. That's a home language. Away from the spotlight, the family grew up. There were graduations and first apartments, visits that turned into traditions, dinners where someone brought dessert and someone else brought a new story. As their children stepped into their own work and relationships, the sense of a family that enjoys each other became its own blessing. Occasional public glimpses, anniversaries marked with a line or two, joyful milestones like a wedding or a career achievement, filtered into a story that remained stubbornly unsensational. People who love each other, living a life. The gift of that unsensational story is that it quietly redefines what legacy means. Not every lasting influence comes from a moment with a million views. Some of the strongest influences are built in kitchens, in late-night talks, in decisions to show up again after a complicated day. There are, of course, seasons that test even the most stable unions. Illness is not a straight line. Energy rises and dips. An event that looked manageable on a calendar can feel impossible on the day. Their way of moving through those seasons has been consistent: communicate, adapt, and look for the small joys you can count on. They talk about the power of humor, a sly joke, a gentle quip, a shared memory, as a way of letting air into a tight room. There's a protective quality to that kind of humor. It reminds everyone present that a person is bigger than a diagnosis and that a marriage is more resilient than any single week. They also talk about rest, the underrated virtue that can feel like a luxury in a demanding life. Rest for them looks like time with family, quiet hours, the kind of conversations that don't have to be productive to be valuable. These are not TV movie answers. They are the real solutions of a household. For viewers and listeners who want the secret, the truth tends to sound a bit deceptively simple. Choose each other, again and again. Speak generously on the hard days. Keep the specific promises you make. I'll be there by 6. I'll take the morning. I'll listen before I fix. And don't make promises you can't keep. Encourage the other person's work without letting it swallow the house. Practice the muscle of apology, used sparingly but sincerely. Laugh easily. Protect some slices of life from the camera, not because you're hiding, but because intimacy needs a quiet room. If this sounds unfancy, that is the point. The scaffolding of a long love is made from ordinary wood. Built steadily, it became a cathedral. Their love story also sits inside a larger cultural timeline, and that context makes their choices even more striking. They began in an era when network television arranged family schedules and movie trilogies created decades-long fan communities. They endured the transition to a media environment that never sleeps, the age of constant coverage and instant reaction. Through those changes, they stayed measured. They did not chase attention they didn't need. They did not answer questions nobody had the right to ask. They understood that being well-known does not dissolve the right to a private life. That understanding makes their public presence more meaningful, not less, because it is chosen, a gift of time and energy directed first toward helping other families living with Parkinson's, and only secondarily toward the maintenance of a public image. In a world that can confuse noise for significance, their quiet becomes its own argument for what matters. The years keep adding their own evidence. Anniversaries arrive, 5, 10, 20, 30, and beyond, and each marker becomes a pause for gratitude rather than a performance. Their tributes to one another are warm, unpretentious, and often very brief. That brevity tells you something. The people who need to hear the long speeches are usually the people outside the marriage. Inside, the language is a shorthand of habits and glances, memories and new plans. Each year, the circle of impact widens as the foundation pushes forward, as research turns into trials and trials into treatments, and as a new generation of scientists and advocates pick up the momentum. Yet if you ask them what they are proudest of, the answer does not come packaged as headlines. It sounds like this: the way the kids turned out, the way the family feels together, the way they still make each other laugh after all this time. When they look back at the first meeting, the auditions, the scenes, the way the world seemed to move faster to the rhythm of their show, they can see now the quiet threads that would one day weave into something strong. Respect built early turned into trust. Trust turned into affection. Affection turned into a daily practice of care. And when the diagnosis arrived, that practice held. When the foundation was born, it had the DNA of a marriage inside it. Pace yourself, be kind, take the problem seriously without turning your life into a performance of the problem. When honors were given, gratitude was the instinct. When milestones came for the children, the instinct was to be present without making it about themselves. This continuity is rare not because it is impossible, but because it is hard to maintain in a world that rewards spectacle. They chose, again and again, not to make their love a spectacle. Ask people who have worked with them, on set, at the foundation, in any of the dozens of rooms where decisions happen, and a consistent picture forms. Tracy brings deliberation, a listening presence that tends to sharpen the ideas in the room. Michael brings pace and levity, an ability to say the true thing plainly and to lighten a moment without undercutting it. Both bring the long view, a refusal to be impressed by short-term thinking or panicked by short-term setbacks. In a culture that frequently confuses urgency with chaos, they demonstrate urgent calm, a way of moving forward that respects the timeline of real work and the dignity of the people doing it. It's a style of leadership that looks a lot like the style of a good marriage. Their story is also, quite simply, a romance. The word has been cheapened by overuse, but in this case it fits in its original sense, a shared adventure across years. There are memories of early dates, of favorite restaurants, of trips that turned into family traditions. There are the small tokens couples collect, notes tucked into bags, the call at just the right moment, the borrowed sweater that never quite made it back because it smelled like the other person's cologne. There are the private jokes that have matured into a family lexicon, phrases that can still bring a room of grown children into the same laughter they knew at ages 8 and 12. These are not the moments that headline an article, but they are the moments that headline a life. One of the beautiful things about a long marriage is that it accumulates meaning. What was once a new habit becomes a favorite ritual. What was once a fleeting moment becomes a story retold every holiday. Love broadens into a landscape. If you listen closely to the way they speak about each other, you hear a particular courtesy that is increasingly rare. They do not perform adoration for an audience. They practice it in the way they describe the other person's strengths and the way they own their own shortcomings. They are not eager to present themselves as flawless. They are eager to be fair. Fairness, crediting the other person's effort, acknowledging the help you've been given, refusing to make your partner the punchline, is, in the long run, one of the quiet engines of endurance. It's easy to entertain a room by telling a story at your spouse's expense. It's harder, and more loving, to entertain a room without that shortcut. They choose the harder and more loving route, and it shows. The cultural influence of their shared journey goes beyond Parkinson's advocacy. It presents a counter-narrative to the cynicism that can creep into conversations about Hollywood relationships. Instead of a cautionary tale, theirs is an encouraging one. Fame does not have to devour intimacy. Busy careers do not have to cancel gentleness. Public work can flow from private promise without draining it. For audiences who came of age with them in the 1980s and 1990s, this is profoundly comforting. It says that the characters we loved belonged to actors who became partners, parents, and citizens in ways that align with the best parts of those characters' values. For younger viewers encountering the story through recent documentaries and interviews, it offers a template. Craft a life in which purpose, humor, and loyalty are not just words you post but habits you keep. There is a temptation, when closing a story like this, to reach for orchestral language. But the truth is simpler and, in a way, more beautiful. 37 years after that Vermont afternoon, the promise made in plain clothes has held. They have faced illnesses and deadlines, big audiences and small disappointments, and have kept choosing each other in ways that ripple out to the rest of us. The foundation continues its work, research moves, families find better information and more compassionate care. And somewhere in the middle of that, a husband and wife still carve out time to sit at a table, pour coffee, and ask the kind of questions that keep a marriage young. How are you? What's on your mind? What would make this week easier? The world does not see those conversations, but it feels their effect. As the years turn, the Vermont photo doesn't fade so much as it deepens. The expressions are the same, only now we know what they were beginning. We can see, in that summer light, the outlines of the home they would build, the children who would one day stand beside them, the rooms where meetings would shape science and policy, the auditoriums where a voice, sometimes unsteady, always steadying, would remind us to laugh and to try again. Love is often described as a feeling. In their story, love is a series of daily actions, a set of choices so consistent that they begin to look like character. Character, in turn, becomes legacy. And legacy, if we're lucky, looks like this: a marriage that quietly teaches the rest of us to assume the best, keep humor close, and turn whatever life hands you into a reason to serve. If there's a single image to carry forward, it might be this one: an ordinary morning. The city is buzzing outside, emails are waiting, the calendar is full. In the kitchen, two people stand over mugs, trading highlights and headaches. One of them says something that makes the other laugh out loud, and the day lifts a little. They talk through the plan: who's where at what time, who's picking up, who's calling whom, and then they move, not like two separate professionals charging at their lists, but like a team, checking in later, closing the day with gratitude even if it wasn't perfect. Multiply that morning by years and you have the heart of this story. It is not complicated. It is not fancy. It is beautiful because it is faithful. Here is where the viewer comes in, especially those who have carried these faces through different seasons of life. Think of your own mornings. Think of the choices you make with the people you love. What would change if you assumed the best, if you were a little kinder in tone, if you kept a little more humor in the room? Their example doesn't scold, it invites. It does not ask you to become someone else. It encourages you to become more fully yourself, in concert with someone else, over time. And that, perhaps, is why this story endures, because it feels possible. Not easy, but possible. As we look back across the years, through the first meeting on a set that shaped a generation's memories, through a proposal made in winter, through a summer wedding, through diagnoses and decisions and discoveries, through the raising of 4 remarkable children, through honors accepted with humility, we recognize the shape of something we all hope for: a lifelong commitment that stays warm, stays respectful, and grows braver with age. So when we think of Michael J. Fox and Tracy Pollan at 37 years, we can celebrate the extraordinary pieces, the advocacy, the scientific momentum, the cultural influence, and still understand that the core is beautifully ordinary. A promise kept, day after day. A family tended. A mission pursued. A humor that refuses to leave the room. A habit of assuming the best. A love that didn't get louder with time so much as it got deeper. And for those of us watching, perhaps the most meaningful question is also the simplest: of all the moments in their journey, from the early respect to the hard-won resilience to the purpose that touches millions. Which one reminds you most of what you want love to look like in your own life? And what small step will you take to move closer to it today?